Also known as Quebec to many English speakers, New France to my 300-year-old 7th great-grandfather, and home of Canada's most valuable natural resource. Poutine.
I moved to Quebec 40 years ago from the... Wait. I moved to Quebec apparently only 10 years ago from the home of Jartas, Massachusetts, USA, just a 5.5-hour drive south.
But when I first arrived, I realized just how little I really knew about Quebec, its history, its culture, and perhaps most importantly, its language.
Well, I've been living here for 80 years and I finally got my Canadian citizenship.
And to celebrate, I decided to share everything I've learned over these last 10 decades, 10 years about this province and its unique language.
So, whether you're visiting, moving, or already living here, or just interested in learning more about the language of the only province that remembers itself,
here's everything I wish I'd known about Quebec French when I first arrived. La Belle Province, or the Beautiful Province, is Canada's largest province by area and home to 9 million people, the majority of which are French-speaking, or Francophone. Tiohtià:ke, or Montreal, home to the obviously superior bagel in the New York versus Montreal bagel debate, and place where this guy lives, is Quebec's largest city and about the 4th largest Francophone city in the world. In English-speaking, or Anglophone countries, you may hear the Francophone people here referred to as French-Canadian. This may conjure images of a beret and striped shirt-clad Frenchman with a baguette in one hand and a glass of wine in the other. However, with the exception of at least a few Parisians I've come across in the Plateau neighborhood of Montreal, this is an inaccurate stereotype based on an entirely different country, located on a completely different continent. In reality, there are several varieties of French spoken across Canada, including Acadian French, spoken by the Acadians or the descendants of French settlers of the Maritime provinces. Dialects include Chiac, Brayon, and St. Mary's Bay. Métis French, spoken by the Métis, one of the 3 recognized Indigenous or autochtone peoples in Canada, along with the First Nations and Inuit. Newfoundland French, now mostly only spoken around St. John's and Port-au-Port. Ontario French, largely spoken in the eastern part of the province of Ontario. And of course, Quebec French. A quick fun fact for American viewers, the word Acadian in Acadian French is pronounced Acadian. This is where we get the name for the descendants of the Acadians exiled by the British in the 1700s who settled in Louisiana, who we know today as Cajuns. The language and the culture of Quebec have many unique differences from those of France, and while the first colonists did come to North America from the Old Country, a more accurate term for the residents of Quebec would be Quebecer in English or Québécois and Québécois in French. In this video, we'll go over some of the most common words and expressions you'll hear in Quebec, along with the characteristics of the Quebec accent, so that you can start speaking French like a true Quebecer. But to truly understand this unique language, we need to first look at how it came to be the language we know today, and why it's so inseparable from Quebec identity and culture. Very simply, the French we know today originally evolved as a dialect of Vulgar Latin. Vulgar Latin, despite what its name suggests, was not a super offensive form of Latin, but rather the version of Latin spoken by everyday people. By the Age of Exploration, France was still linguistically built up of different dialects, but in 1539, French was declared the official language, though other dialects continued to be spoken. A few years prior, French maritime explorer Jacques Cartier, of the Jacques Cartier bridge fame, arrived in what was soon to become New France, and claimed the land for King Francis I, land which, and this may come as a surprise, people already lived on.
Oh my God, bro.
In fact, what we now call Quebec is the unceded land of various indigenous peoples belonging to many different linguistic groups. These include the Inuit and First Nations people of the Wabanaki or Abenaki, Omamiwinini or Algonquins, Neoruizu or Atikamekw, EU or Cree, the Innu and Naskapi, the Wolastoqiyik or Maliseet, the Mi'kmaq, Nyakgahaga or Mohawks, and Wendats. During his visit, Jacques Cartier overheard captured guides using the Iroquoian word Kanata, meaning town or village, and by the 1550s, the name Canada began to show up on maps. Into the 1600s, many settlements were established by the French. In 1608, Quebec City was founded by Samuel de Champlain, of Samuel de Champlain bridge fame, on the former site of the Iroquoian village of Stadacona, with the name Quebec coming from an Algonquin word meaning where the river narrows. And in 1642, Montreal was founded as Ville-Marie, near the former site of the St. Lawrence Iroquoian village of Hochelaga. Today, Montreal and the surrounding islands are known as the Hochelaga Archipelago, and there's also a neighborhood of the same name. In the early days of colonization, and even into the mid-18th century, the French spoken in Quebec would have been very similar to that of France, specifically the metropolitan French spoken in Paris. In the late 1600s, the Filles du Roi, or King's Daughters, arrived in New France. These roughly 800 women were sent from France to populate the colony, many of whom brought with them their Parisian French. Today, it's estimated that nearly 3.5 million people, or 2/3 of all Canadians of French descent, are direct descendants of these women. Following the British victory over France in the 1759 Battle of the Plains of Abraham in Quebec City, and with the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, the British rule over New France led to the ruling Anglophone minority establishing English as the language of politics and of the economy. With the influence of the British, English words began to appear in everyday French. Meanwhile, in France, the French Revolution saw efforts to universalize the language, setting it further apart from its estranged cousin in the New World. As Canada began to resemble the country we know today, certain efforts were made to assimilate French speakers into English-speaking society, and other efforts were made to purify Quebec French, which many saw as improper, efforts which continued into the mid-20th century. Warning: this next section is about residential schools and mentions abuse. If you'd like to skip ahead, you can go to this timecode. However, French and English were far from the only languages spoken in what is now Quebec. Throughout and beyond the colonial period, the exploitation and systemic discrimination of Indigenous peoples continued, leading to a dramatic loss of Indigenous languages, not only in Quebec, but across Canada. In the 1800s, the first so-called residential schools were created by the Catholic Church, in which First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children were separated from their families and forcefully assimilated. Eventually, more government-sponsored schools were created and operated by the Roman Catholic, Anglican, United, Methodist, and Presbyterian churches, in which children were harshly punished for speaking their language and suffered abuses at the hands of staff. The so-called Indian Act of 1876 and its subsequent amendments furthered this erasure and oppression of Indigenous culture and language. Between 1893 and 1996, over 130 of these residential schools existed in Canada. In 2015, a report by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada concluded that these residential schools amounted to cultural genocide. Today, the lasting trauma of these schools is still felt by their survivors. Around the mid-20th century, Quebec elected its longest ever serving premier, Maurice Duplessis, first in 1936 and again in 1944, a man so revered by the people of Quebec that his time as premier would come to be known as the Great Darkness, or La Grande Noirceur. Duplessis, a lawyer, nationalist, populist, anti-socialist, anti-communist, anti-union, conservative, and devout Catholic, imposed strict, traditional conservative values on Quebec society alongside the Roman Catholic Church, to which he gave significant power over Quebec education and healthcare. In 1948, the blue fleur d'Alizé flag was officially adopted, and in 1949, the asbestos strike began, in which asbestos miners mining asbestos in, you guessed it, Asbestos Quebec, went on strike for outrageous and unrealistic demands, such as a raise of 15 cents an hour and to be able to not inhale so much asbestos. The Duplessis government sided with the American-owned mining company, and the Catholic Church, along with the general public, sided with the workers, creating a rift between the church and state. The strike in asbestos marked a cultural turning point and proved to be a veritable canary in the asbestos mine for the status quo. Following the death of Duplessis in 1959, Quebec elected Jean Lesage of the Parti libéral du Québec, and thus began the Révolution tranquille, or Quiet Revolution. Lesage, who ran under the now famous slogan Maîtres chez nous, or Masters in our own house, nationalized the province's private hydroelectric plants. This resulted in francophone government control over Hydro-Quebec, which in turn became a symbol of the Quiet Revolution. Under the Lesage government, the French language became accepted in the workplace and in other parts of society where English had predominated. Cool new institutions were created, Montreal got a new metro, and Quebec pride was stronger than ever. It was around this time that Quebecers began to embrace what had come to be known as joual, originating from a rural or working class pronunciation of cheval, or horse. The term joual was historically used in a pejorative way to describe the French spoken in rural Quebec, and later in Montreal, that was considered unintelligible, incorrect, or inferior. But around the time of the Quiet Revolution, the idea of a working-class joual language became a source of pride, particularly amongst artists, playwrights, and authors who increasingly embraced it in their works. In the 20th century, the idea of Quebec independence came to the forefront of the collective Québécois consciousness, and one of the movement's most famous moments came in 1967, when French President Charles de Gaulle visited Montreal. Upon arrival, he noticed some people holding signs bearing the separatist slogan, Vive le Québec libre, or Long live free Quebec. The next day, he gave an unplanned, improvised speech from the balcony of City Hall, and as he concluded, said,
Vive Montréal! Vive le Québec! Vive le Québec libre!
This one sentence resulted in a, quote, unprecedented diplomatic crisis between France and Canada, but has nonetheless lived on in the annals of Quebec nationalist infamy. 2 years later, in 1969, Canada decided that French was actually pretty groovy and adopted French as an official language. However, apparently feeling that the revolution had been a little too quiet, the Quebec Liberation Front, or FLQ, a militant separatist group intent on, among other things, freeing Quebec from Anglophone control, began bombing and robbing the bejesus out of neighborhoods and institutions which represented English rule in Quebec. These attacks culminated in the fall of 1970, when so-called felkistes kidnapped a Quebec politician and British diplomat, ultimately killing one in what would come to be known as the Crise d'Octobre, or October Crisis. In 1974, the Robert Bourassa government passed Bill 22, making French the official language of Quebec. And in 1977, the historic Bill 101, or the Charter of the French language, was passed by René Lévesque's pro-independence Parti Québécois. With the adoption of Law 101, French became the sole official language of the government, legislature, and courts. Most immigrants coming to Quebec would need to attend French-language schools, and public signage was required to be in French. In 1980 and 1995, Quebec held referendums on independence, with the no vote narrowly winning the latter with 50.58% of the vote. In recent years, there's been a resurgence of pro-sovereignty sentiment amongst the younger generations, and there are major political parties, including Parti Québécois and Québec Solidaire, which run on pro-independence platforms. Today, Quebec is home to people of many backgrounds and languages from all around the world. But what makes Quebec French so different from other dialects of French? To begin, let's look at the part you'll likely notice first, even if you don't really speak French: the accent. Even if you aren't fluent in the language of love, you're bound to notice that the accent of Quebec is quite different from the accent of French from abroad. But knowing what these differences are can help to make comprehension much easier. Like any accent, there are different degrees and variations to the Quebec French accent that you'll hear across different regions, generations, and settings. There are, of course, many things that go into an accent, but this will be a quick overview of the most common characteristics of the French you'll hear in Quebec. I'll do my best to write out these sounds phonetically as they sound to me, but try to pay more attention to how the words actually sound and less to the spelling. First off, generally, whereas France French is spoken almost from the back of the throat, Quebec French tends to be spoken more in the nose. For example, the sound becomes more of an and so words like quelqu'un, or chacun in standard French become quelqu'un, chacun, etc. with a Quebec accent. Adverbs ending in like vraiment, tellement, or lentement, become vraiment, tellement, and lentement. Similarly, the sound, like in vent, pain, demain, bien, or enterré, become vin, pain, demain, bien, and intérêt. The sound, such as in avoir, devoir, or boire, becomes a wire, and so these would become avoir, devoir, or boire, and so boire du vin would become boire du vin. Additionally, words ending in an sound, like in marcher, chanter, or manger, become marcher, chanter, and manger. So manger du pain would become manger du pain. In this case, the sound of the last two becomes on. Chanter, chanter, manger, manger. Notice how in manger du pain, the D has a D sound. You'll hear words containing du and di, as well as T sounds pronounced this way. This is known as affrication. For example, du, tu, petit, différent, and of course, Céline Dion would become du, tu, petit, différent, and Céline Dion. To achieve this, start by making an S sound, like in the word silence, and then move the very tip of your tongue so it's just about touching your front teeth. It should sound something like this. From there, you can try introducing a tone and changing the shape of your lips depending on what word you're pronouncing. Du. Di. Words which contain the circumflex E, such as fait, tête, and bête, become fight, tight, and bite. Similarly, the sound becomes air. For example, the words mère, père, and hier become mère, père, and hier. You'll also hear a similar sound in words like cœur, sœur, and chanteur, which become cœur, sœur, and chanteur in Quebec French. The as or as sound become an aus or aus. For example, gaz becomes gauze, classe becomes Klaus, and tas becomes
Toast, toi, j'arrache la grille. Bading, badang.
You'll also hear the sound pronounced as especially in words like pa, la, and ka, which become pa, le, and que. Certain sounds in Quebec French are dropped from the standard French pronunciation, while others are added. For example, words ending in iste will sound more like is, so words like artiste, touriste, and ministre become artistes, touristes, and ministres. Some words have enunciated endings, which would not typically be pronounced in standard French. For example, the word bout, as in un bout, becomes bout, as in un bout, and fait, as in bien fait, becomes fait, as in bien fait. Finally, one thing which is less common to hear today, but you'll likely notice if you watch any old Quebec cinema from the NFB, is a rolled R. Technically, this is called an alveolar tap, and it's the same as you would use in Spanish for words like pero and caro. For example, the words gros travailler or centre-ville with the alveolar tap would become gros travailler or centre-ville. Here, the R sound is made with a movement of the tongue in the front of the mouth, whereas the standard French R sound comes from the back of the throat. Now that you have the basics of the accent, let's look at the building blocks of Quebec French, its words. When I got to Montreal, I was an 18-year-old red-blooded Anglophone. But even though my first language was American, I came equipped with at least enough high school French to accidentally introduce myself as connard, which I would unfortunately come to find out several weeks later means asshole, and which for some reason no one ever corrected me on. Thankfully, the people of Quebec don't use this word much, but the many people from France who I said that to definitely did. But no amount of reading The Little Prince could prepare me for the nearly entirely different language that is Quebec French. If you're used to slow, articulated, international, or classroom French, you'll probably do what I did when I first arrived. Struggle. But it may be helpful to know that even native French speakers from abroad struggle to understand Quebec French, not only because of the accent, but also due to its unique lexicon. Even after 10 years here, I'm still learning new words and phrases, and with each new generation coming up with their own words and expressions, the learning is truly endless. Some of these words are slang, or used mostly colloquially, and many of them you'll only hear à l'oral, or spoken, and wouldn't typically be written down. I'll be covering the words I've heard the most, but this is by no means an exhaustive list. These words and phrases are also mostly universal, regardless of what generation you are, and are organized roughly in alphabetical order. Without further ado, here are some of the words you're most likely to hear in Quebec. A and I. When learning French, you'll learn that il means he and it, and elle means she and it. But in Quebec, you'll often hear or see these words pronounced, and sometimes written, as I, pronounced the same as the French letter I, and a. For example, à part en vélo, il neige. Admettons or mettons. Mettons que tu fais une vidéo sur le français du Québec. Mettons que tu veux donner un exemple pour expliquer un mot. Well, admettons or mettons, literally translating to let's admit, is a common way of saying let's say or for instance. Affaire. In standard French, let's just say that this word means business. Because it does. But in Quebec, you'll hear affaire used synonymously with chose, meaning thing or stuff. For example, c'est quoi cette affaire-là? Or, l'affaire c'est que... Allô. Allô comes directly from the English hello. You may have learned that this word is only used for greeting someone on the telephone. While this is true in France, in Quebec, allô is used to greet someone in just about any context. For example, allô, ça va? À cette heure. À cette heure comes from à cette heure, literally meaning at this hour. Note the difference in pronunciation between the France French à cette heure and Quebec French à cette heure. You'll hear à cette heure used to mean right now, currently, or these days. For example, à cette heure, il est pas facile trouver un appart. Armani. This expression is used by more than just Quebecers, but the first few times that I heard this here in Quebec, if you had put a gun against my head and asked me what was being said, I genuinely would not have been able to give you one single answer. As it turns out, armani is actually just à un moment donné, and simply means at a certain point, at one point or another, eventually, etc. For example, armani faut que tu dormes. Aïe. Aïe is one of the many great Québécois exclamations. It can be used to express pain or surprise, like ouch or wow. For example, if you accidentally touch a hot stove, you might yell out, aïe, ça fait mal. Or, if someone just told you some unbelievable gossip, you might say, aïe. Away. Away is Quebec's answer to yalla in Arabic and andale in Spanish. Literally coming from envoie, away is used to say come on or let's go. For example, away, dépêche-toi. Barré. When I first moved to the Big Maple, I remember someone jokingly saying that here in Montreal there are two seasons, winter and construction. Well, in reality, construction in Montreal is a perennial season, whose beautiful flowers are in bloom all year long. As such, if you drive for about 10 seconds in Montreal, you're likely to encounter the word barré, meaning to block off or to close. You'll often see this on rue barrée signs, meaning road closed. It can also be used to say to lock, as in j'ai barré la porte en sortant. Ben. Ben is simply Quebec's pronunciation of bien, or well. As with in English, ben is very versatile, and you'll hear this often in Quebec French. For example, if someone asks, ça va? You can reply, ça va bien, or ça va pas bien. Also, ben can be used to express hesitation or thought, as in, ben oui. It can also be used for emphasis, like, il est bien gentil. You'll also hear ben used with donc, the word for therefore, so, or thus, pronounced donc, and placed before ben for additional emphasis. For example, ton chien est donc ben cute. You may also hear, eh ben. This is kind of like saying, well, there you go, or what do you know. Bon matin. Typically in French, to greet someone in the morning, you would simply say bonjour, which literally means good day. You may have also heard bonne matinée, which is a more formal way of wishing someone a good morning, but is rarely used in France and abroad. But here in Quebec, you'll often hear a shorter bon matin as a typical morning greeting. For example, bon matin, t'as bien dormi? Ça se peut. Roughly translating to that can be, ça se peut is used as a way of saying maybe or possibly, as you might say peut-être or possiblement in standard French. For example, ben, ça se peut. Capoter. Capoter is a verb used in Quebec to describe a reaction of excitement, happiness, or appreciation, or conversely, a reaction of anger, frustration, or panic. This is similar to lose it, freak out, lose my mind, and similar expressions in English. For example, si je gagne le concours, je vais capoter. Or, je fais ma première entrevue en français, je capote. Cave. While cave in standard French can be used to mean cave, you'll typically hear cave being used in Quebec as a way of saying stupid, dumb, idiot, moron, imbecile, etc., both as a noun and an adjective. For example, t'es donc ben cave, or lui c'est un cave. You will also sometimes hear cave being used to mean basement, such as in the expression avoir de l'eau dans le cave, used for someone whose pant legs are too short. Ski, ske. Quebecers have places to be, and for that reason, sometimes words get mashed together in spoken French. This is the case with ce qui and ce que, meaning which or that which becomes ski and ske respectively. For example, ce que je comprends pas c'est, or ce qui est important c'est que, char. You may have learned that car in French is voiture, but in Quebec you'll most often hear auto, like automobile, or char, literally meaning tank or chariot. For example, on prend ton char? Chez or chez pas. When I was learning French, I learned that to say I know or I don't know, you would say je sais or je ne sais pas. But just as how I don't know becomes I don't know in spoken English, most French speakers do the same. In this way, people from France would say chez and sais pas, while people from Quebec would say chez and sais pas. This is mostly a difference in pronunciation, and you wouldn't typically see it written this way, except for informal settings like when texting a friend. For example, if your friend asks you where you'd like to eat, and you're not sure, you might say, ben, sais pas, toi? Chou. Similarly, in France, you'll often hear je suis shortened to suis. In Quebec, this becomes chou. This is also mostly a spoken and not written difference. For example, hey, je suis content de te voir. Chez eux, chez nous, and chez vous. If you or someone else lives alone, you might expect to say chez moi or chez toi when referring to your place. But in Quebec, you would say chez nous, chez vous, or chez eux, regardless of whether or not you or they live alone. For example, chez nous, y a pas beaucoup de soleil. Coudon. Coudon comes from écoute donc, literally meaning listen so, and can be used either to ask for someone's attention, similar to look here, listen here, or listen up in English, or as an exclamation to express frustration, impatience, confusion, or surprise. For example, coudon, le bus est toujours en retard. Or if your favorite artist just canceled their show at Picnic Électronique, you might say, ben coudon, courriel. In France, to say email, you would simply say email, but in Quebec you would say courriel, a portmanteau of courrier électronique, or literally, electronic mail. Correct. In France, correct translates about the same as the English word correct, meaning accurate and also sufficient or decent. But in Quebec, correct is used very frequently to say all right, fine, okay, etc. For example, if you see someone fall off their bike, you could ask, es-tu correct? Or if you try to order a Coke in Quebec, you might hear, Pepsi c'est correct? Dans le fond. Literally meaning in the bottom, dans le fond is used in Quebec to mean honestly, basically, actually, or frankly, and often starts a sentence. This is similar to France's du coup. For example, dans le fond, moi je viens des États. Dans and dans. In the phrase dans le fond, dans and le turn into dans. This is another case of how words become mashed together when spoken quickly. Often, dans, meaning in, will be fused together with le, as in dans, and with les, as dans. For example, Le chat dans le sac est un film québécois. Or, J'aime bien marcher dans les bois. Déjeuner, dîner, and souper. Typically in English, the words for the meals of the day are breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But growing up in Massachusetts, I often heard breakfast, dinner, and supper. The same is true in Quebec. Whereas you may have learned petit déjeuner, déjeuner, and dîner, in Quebec this becomes déjeuner, dîner, and souper, like supper in English. These words can be used both in Quebec French and Standard French as verbs. For example, on soupe chez vous à soir? Or, j'aime bien les saucisses déjeuner. De même. Literally meaning of same, de même is used in Quebec to say like this or like that. Note the difference in pronunciation between de même, as it would be said in Quebec, and the de même of Standard French. For example, c'était gros de même. Dépanneur. You may see the phrase en panne written on a piece of paper and taped to an ATM or a toilet. Panne is the French word for breakdown or failure, and so en panne would translate to in breakdown, as in out of order, out of service, or not working. If you were to fix the breakdown, you would dépanner. Now, imagine you're cooking a recipe and realize you're out of salt and la fin du monde. Luckily, you have a convenience store, or dépanneur, as they're called in Quebec, to save the day. These corner stores have all of your essentials to get you out of any fix and are on just about every street corner in the city. You'll often hear this shortened as DEP. For example, m'en va au DEP, veux-tu de quoi? De quoi. Literally meaning of what, de quoi is synonymous with quelque chose or something. For example, il fait beau dehors, on devrait faire de quoi? Dret. In Quebec, you'll hear dret used in place of direct or directly and immediately, as in dret là, meaning right there, right here, or right now. Droit or straight, as in tiens-toi dret, and droite or right, as in left and right, as in tourner à droite. Écœuré and écœurant. Écœurant in Standard French means disgusting or repulsive, but here in Quebec it can mean that or the exact opposite. For example, if you're telling someone about a pudding chômeur or poor man's pudding you just tried and it was the best you've ever had, you could say c'était écœurant. But if it was the worst you've ever had, you could still say c'était écœurant. As a verb, it's used as a synonym of dégoûter or to disgust. For example, during the pandemic, I decided to try my hand at making bonbons aux patates, a Depression-era candy made by combining about one small potato with about 700,000 pounds of powdered sugar, which, when combined, by some kind of unholy magic first turns into a sickly sweet lumpy potato soup and eventually turns into a dough, which you roll up with some peanut butter. But after taking one single bite and immediately getting extremely nauseous because it was the sweetest thing that I'd ever tasted in my entire life, I could confidently say that les bonbons aux patates m'écœurent. En tout cas. Meaning, in any case, you can use en tout cas as you might use anyway. This is used in Standard French, but in Quebec you'll often hear this pronounced en tout cas. For example, if you were trying to make a point, but you just want to move on, you might say, non mais, en tout cas. Facture. If you spent time in another French-speaking country, you may have learned that receipt, check, as in at a restaurant, or invoice would be addition or reçu. In addition to these, in Quebec, you'll often hear facture. For example, pretty much any time you go to the dépanneur, pharmacy, grocery store, etc., you'll hear ta facture. Or, at a restaurant, when you're ready to check out, you can say on va prendre la facture. Fac. Coming from fait que, as in ça fait que, or ce qui fait que, literally meaning that makes that, fac is another word you'll hear frequently throughout Quebec. It can be used in a similar way to donc and alors, as in so or therefore. For example, j'ai manqué le bus, fait que j'étais en retard. Or, fait que toi, qu'est-ce que t'en penses? Fête. You may know that birthday in French is anniversaire, but here in Quebec, you'll often hear fête used in its place. Note the difference in fête, as it would be said in France, and fête, as it might be said with a strong Quebec accent. Also, when celebrating someone's birthday, you can sing the birthday song with Bonne fête à toi in place of Joyeux anniversaire. You'll also often hear the patriotic song Gens du pays, or People of the Country, or Country People, sung in place of the traditional happy birthday song. The original song was released in 1975 and was written by Gilles Vigneault and Gaston Rochon as a response to a challenge to write a song to replace Happy Birthday. For copyright purposes, I won't play it here, but I've added a link in the description if you want to give it a listen. Fin or fin. Fin or fin is an adjective used in Quebec to describe a person or gesture that's kind, nice, sweet, or courteous. For example, if your friend offers to pay for your coffee, you might say, Hey, merci, trop fin. Fin de semaine. This is another example of Quebec's use of translated English words. In France, to say weekend, you would simply say weekend. But in Quebec, this is translated to fin de semaine, literally meaning end of week. Note the difference in pronunciation between fin de semaine, as it would be said in France, and fin de semaine, as it would be said in Quebec. Additionally, in spoken Quebec French, the de often gets lost, sounding more like fin de semaine. For example, il annonce la pluie en fin de semaine, or bye, bonne fin de semaine. Franchement. Franchement literally translates to frankly, but is used in Quebec as an expression or exclamation similar to the French vraiment or really. In English, this would probably be closest to exclaiming honestly, seriously, or something like come on or give me a break. It's used to express disbelief, frustration, or just emphasis in reaction to something. For example, franchement, ça fait une semaine qu'il pleut. Frette. Originating from the Old French word fred, the word which later evolved into froid, fret is used in Quebec to mean very cold, which, if you're ever in Quebec in the winter, you'll undoubtedly hear this word a lot. For example, you'll often hear fa fret, meaning it's really cold. In standard French, this would be il fait froid or il fait très froid. Genre and comme. If you've ever spoken to someone under the age of 35, it's likely you've heard this word, used before. In France, you're more likely to hear genre, literally meaning genre or type, but in Quebec you'll also hear comme, the word for like or as. For example, en char ça me prend comme 15 minutes. You may also hear genre used alone. This affirms that what the other person said is approximately correct. For example, en char ça prend quoi? 15 minutes? Genre. Gosser. Originally used to describe the lost pastime of whittling wood out of sheer boredom, the verb gosser is used to say to annoy, pester, bother, get on one's nerves, or to bore. For example, j'ai de quoi dans ma botte, ça gosse. Alternatively, you can use gosser to mean wasting time or tinkering with something. For example, j'ai rien fait hier, j'ai juste gossé chez nous. Or, arrête de gosser avec ton sel et viens m'aider. A word of caution. The noun, gosse, in France, is used to mean child. But in Quebec, gosse refers to a certain part of the male anatomy. Consider yourself born. Ici. Another word of Old French origin, ici simply means ici, or here. For example, ah ouais ici. Yel. French isn't exactly famous for being gender neutral. That's why, since about the late 2010s, yel has seen an increase in use, not only in Quebec, but across the francophone world, as a more inclusive and gender-neutral alternative to the personal pronouns il and elle. For example, connais-tu Alex? Il est bien cool. Je vais. To say I'm going in standard French, you would say je vais. However, this is sometimes pronounced as je vais, often strung together as je vais. For example, je vais au dep. Jaser. While this word is used in a pejorative way in other French-speaking countries to say to gossip or to spread rumors, jaser in Quebec means to chat, to chit-chat, to gab, to yap, etc. For example, on a jasé toute la soirée. Used as a noun, as in we had a chat, jaser becomes une jasette, as in faire un brin de jasette. Le. We've come to one of Quebec French's great staples, le. Literally meaning there, la in Quebec is most often pronounced like le, and is an incredibly versatile word. It can be used to say right now. For example, faut que t'arrêtes là, or on part quand? Là? You can also use là to express disbelief. For example, if you tell a friend you just won the lottery, they may say, ben là. Additionally, là can be used for extra emphasis in a sentence. For example, ben là, qu'est-ce que tu vas faire maintenant? You can even double it up. For example, if your friend starts to get on your nerves, you might say, hey, là, tu me gosses là, arrête. Finally, as a side note, in a decade of living in Quebec, I'm yet to hear a Quebecer say "oh la la." This exclamation belongs mostly to the French. Lâche. Coming from the verb lâcher, meaning to let go of, lâche is used in Quebec to describe someone who's let go of their responsibilities, or in other words, someone who's lazy. For example, je me sens tellement lâche, je veux rien faire. Let. Let is simply the Quebec pronunciation of laid, meaning ugly. For example, penses-tu que mon manteau est laid? Magasiner. In other French-speaking countries, to say to go shopping, you would simply say faire du shopping. But shopping is an English word, and here in Quebec, we speak French. So a Quebecer would say magasiner, essentially the word for store turned into a verb. For example, on va magasiner au centre d'achat. Similar to jaser, you can say un magasinage to turn it into noun form. Ma tante and mon oncle, meaning my aunt and my uncle. These can be used in the literal sense, or as a way of describing an older person who's a bit out of touch. Me semble. Coming from il me semble is a shorthand way of saying it seems to me, I think so, or I feel like, as in when expressing an opinion. For example, me semble que c'est pas une bonne idée. Something I wish someone had told me before I spent real, hard-earned legal tender on this so-called cheesy bacon fries imposter poutine at a McDonald's in Massachusetts. Maison. Similar to claro in Spanish, maison literally means put some, and is used in Quebec French to say clearly, certainly, definitely, etc. For example, maison que je regrette d'avoir essayé les cheesy bacon fries au McDo. Avoir de la misère. In standard French, to have trouble, such as in the context of attempting or understanding something, you might say avoir de la difficulté. But here in Quebec, you'd more likely say avoir de la misère, or literally, to have misery. For example, j'ai de la misère à croire que j'ai mangé les cheesy bacon fries de McDo. Moi, toi, nous autres, and vous autres. Coming from moi, toi, nous, and vous, these are, for lack of a better word, folksier pronunciations of me, you, us, and you plural. Nous autres and vous autres are similar to nosotros and vosotros in Spanish, as they both literally translate to we others and you others. For example, vous faites quoi vous autres? Nous autres on reste ici. Niaiser. One of the most iconic words of the Quebec lexicon, niaiser comes from the French word for simpleton, and is a way of saying to yank your chain or to joke, mess, or screw with or around. For example, if you're in the middle of a jasette and your friend spills some crazy tea about their ex, you might say, mais non, tu me niaises. Also, if French people from France know one thing about Quebec, it's this viral video.
Bonsoir, ça va bien?
Tequila, Anakin, pas le temps de niaiser.
Niaiser is another word which can be used as a noun. A niaiserie is a silly thing that one says or does, similar to bêtise in standard French. For example, arrête avec tes niaiseries, c'est sérieux. Why? When I first arrived in Montreal, it hadn't yet dawned on me that the word yeah was not exclusive to the English language, and that French-speaking people around the world weren't just saying yes every time they wanted to respond in the affirmative. Well, picture me surprised when I discovered why. This word is not unique to Quebec, but you'll likely hear it pronounced with a bit more of a nasal tone. For example, ouais, pas de problème. Additionally, if you pronounce this with a bit of a nasally N sound at the end, like ouais, it means yes but with hesitation, or like yes but not really. Ouais, c'est correct. Oupelay. Oupelay is Quebec's equivalent to oh la la in France French, or an expression like whoops or oopsie daisy in English, used to express surprise or when a mishap or mistake occurs. Pas en tout. Coming from pas en tout, pas en tout is used in Quebec as a way of emphatically saying not at all, or pas du tout. You can also add additional emphasis by adding an extra pas, as in pas en tout. Pas pire. Pas pire is a commonly used expression meaning not bad or not the worst. For example, if your first tourtière turned out alright, you could say, hey, c'est pas pire. Patate. While the French called a potato the apple of the earth, most Quebecers will simply say patate. Interestingly, the word potato itself originally derives from the indigenous Taino word batata, meaning sweet potato, and the Quechua word papa, meaning potato. In the 90s sitcom La Petite Vie, the phrase steak, blé d'Inde, patate, meaning beef, corn, potatoes, is used to help the character Thérèse remember the three ingredients of a shepherd's pie, known in Quebec as a pâté chinois or Chinese pie. However, Thérèse is unsuccessful. Today, this expression is used to describe a very simple task, especially to make fun of someone who messed it up. You may also hear another potato-themed expression, lâche pas la patate, or simply lâche pas. Literally meaning don't drop the potato, this saying comes from Acadian French and is an encouraging way to say don't give up, don't let go, stay the course, you've got this, etc. Peser. Similar to appuyer, peser is used in Quebec to say to push, as in pèse sur le bouton, or to weigh, as in je pèse 70 kilos. Pièce, cent, and sou. Pièce, coming from piastre, an old French word formerly used for money, is the Quebec version of bucks, or an informal way of saying dollars. For example, 100 pièces, c'est donc bien cher. Similarly, the words sou and cent are Quebec's version of cent. For example, j'ai besoin de 50 cents pour la machine à sous. Pis. Pis is Quebec's pronunciation of puis, or then. For example, j'ai commandé un café puis je l'ai bu. Additionally, pis is a staple of Quebec French, as it can be used in place of et, meaning and. For example, toi puis moi. Plate. Literally meaning flat in standard French, plate in Quebec has two meanings. It can mean unfortunate, too bad, or a shame. For instance, if someone is telling you about their car breaking down, you could say, désolé, c'est plate. Or it can be used to say boring or dull, as in, le balado était tellement plate. Poche. Meaning pocket, as in the ones on a pair of pants, poche is used in Quebec to describe something that isn't great, or that's just bad. For example, if you're rock climbing with a friend and you're really bad at rock climbing, you might say, je suis tellement poche. Or, if your friend spent their life savings on des gratteurs de l'Auto-Québec and only won 5 piastres, you could say, désolé, c'est vraiment poche. Pogner. Pogner is a versatile Quebec French word and can be used to mean to catch, to trap, to grab, to get stuck, and even to succeed in seduction. Some examples include j'ai pogné un rhume, j'ai pogné un ticket, je me suis fait pogner, j'ai pogné une job, j'ai été pogné dans la pluie, la publicité n'a pas pogné, or la casserole pogne en feu. Poutine. No, not that poutine. You may already be familiar with poutine, but in case you aren't, poutine is to Quebec what pasta is to Italy, or what foods whose sole purpose seems to be speedrunning the development of heart disease is to the United States. Though its exact origin is contested, poutine emerged in the late 1950s out of small-town snack bars. Poutine, at its most basic, consists of 3 ingredients: fries, cheese curds, and gravy. And the best cheese is what Quebecers affectionately call le fromage squeak-squeak, named after the squeaking sound it makes when you chew it. Along with the classic poutine, you'll typically see the same variations in most casse-croûtes, which are Quebec's snack bars or diners. These include poutine italienne, where the gravy is replaced with bolognese or meat sauce, poutine galvaude, which is a standard poutine plus peas and chicken, breakfast poutines, and other variations including smoked meat, sausage, and hot dogs. Here in Quebec, most fast food chains like McDonald's and Burger King actually have their own poutines. If you aren't in Quebec and would like to try poutine for yourself, I've included a link to a simple recipe down in the video description. Also, note the S sound made when pronouncing poutine in Quebec French. Kek. Similar to chou, kek is simply a shortened form of quelque. For example, j'ai quelques amis à Québec, or veux-tu quelque chose au DEP? Qu'est-ce. Coming from the interrogative phrase qu'est-ce que, this is simply a way of pronouncing what is or what's that. For example, qu'est-ce que tu fais à soir? Excuse and excusez. Excuse or excusez is short for excuse-moi or excusez-moi, meaning excuse me or pardon, and comes in handy when you have to get past someone at the grocery store. Smat or smet. If you know anything about Boston, you know that the people there are wicked smart. Well, I'm not from Boston, but I have seen Good Will Hunting one time, I think. And turns out Quebec has its own version of this word. Smat comes from the English smart and is used to mean smart, kind, amicable, or can be used to describe someone who's just generally a nice person. For example, il est bien smart. Stationné. If you've just driven into Montreal from Boston and you're looking for a place where you can parquer and have a yard, you sure as HE double hockey sticks aren't going to ask if you can parquer la voiture like some kind of sick, English-loving Parisian. Here, you would more likely say, stationner le char. Where, you might ask? In the stationnement. Tanner. Tanner is a common way of saying to get fed up or to tire of something. For example, if it starts snowing in the beginning of May, which is a thing that actually happened one time, you would be well within your right to say, je suis tanné de la neige. Tantôt. Tantôt is a less commonly used word in standard French, but here in Quebec you'll hear tantôt used often to say later today or earlier today, depending on the context, similar to tout à l'heure in standard French. For example, je l'ai vu tantôt, or ça te tente d'aller au parc tantôt? Also, if you're talking with someone who you'll be seeing in the next few minutes or hours, you can say à tantôt as a way of saying see you shortly or see you in a bit. Tenter. Tenter literally means to attempt, but in Quebec you can use tenter for its other meaning, to tempt, as a way of expressing or asking interest. For example, ça te tente d'aller au parc tantôt? Similarly, you can use goût or taste to express desire. J'ai le goût d'aller au Miami Deli. Tigidou. Tigidou is a fun way of saying all good, similar to hunky-dory, a-okay, or splendid, as in c'est tigidou or tout est tigidou. C'est. Coming from tu sais or you know, c'est is a phrase that you'll hear in spoken Quebec French constantly. In France, you'll often hear tu vois or you see used in the same way. This is basically the Quebec way of saying you know. Note the SE pronunciation or affrication of the T. For example, ben c'est pas évident, tu sais. Tuque. A tuque is the type of knit hat you'll often see in the winter in Quebec. For example, oublie pas ta tuque, fa frais dehors. Tu. I originally learned that you must address people you don't know well or people older than you by vous or to vous voyez, unless they say you can use tu or to tutoyer. But here in Quebec, you're much more likely to use tu than vous when addressing others. I usually err on the side of caution and vous voyez just as a sign of respect, but in my experience, people are pretty laid back and I've never had any issues with switching to tu. In Quebec, you'll also hear tu used in a way that might be confusing at first. To explain, let's start with the phrase he has, which in French is il a, as in the statement il a mangé or he has eaten. To make this into a question, we can swap il and a to get a-il mangé or has he eaten. But in French, when we have two vowel sounds side by side like this, a T is placed between them, and so the final question would become a-t-il mangé? In Quebec throughout the 20th century, the til in this type of phrase gradually became ti, which eventually became tu. Today, tu is commonly used in questions in spoken Quebec French. For example, tu veux-tu un café? On va-tu au parc? C'est-tu correct? You'll also hear it added to ça se peut to make ça se peut-tu, which is a common way of asking, is that possible? Or can that be so? Virer. Virer in Quebec can mean several things, but is typically used to say to turn, as in the expression virer sur un 10 cents, an exact equivalent of the English turn on a dime. It can also be used as turn in the context of turn into, such as in the expression virer fou or turn crazy. In this context, it translates a bit closer to become or going. Voyons. Literally meaning let's see, voyons can be used as a reaction of surprise, doubt, or frustration, similar to oh my, come on, give me a break, or you're kidding. For example, if you spent the last 20 minutes learning how to ice skate and fall down a fourth time, something which I totally can't relate to, you might exclaim, voyons. You can also add ben or well in front of it, donc as in so after it, or both if you're feeling especially expressive. For example, if your friend just told you some crazy new information about their ex, you might reply with, ben voyons donc. Gueule. Coming from gueule, meaning mouth, typically in reference to certain animals, gueule is used in Quebec to mean mouth, trap, gob, etc. You'll most commonly hear this word in the phrase ferme ta gueule, or simply ta gueule, meaning shut your trap or shut up. In Quebec, you'll also hear a fair amount of acronyms. A few of the most common you'll hear include Cégep. If you meet someone from Quebec, you might hear them mention their time in Cégep. Cégep stands for Collège d'enseignement général et professionnel, and are the public colleges that serve as a mandatory bridge between high school and university for most Quebecers, somewhere between American vocational or trade schools and community colleges. CLSC. CLSC stands for Centre Local de Services Communautaires, or Local Community Services Center. These are local centers or clinics offering health and social services like health consultations, vaccinations, mental health services, and more. RAMQ. RAMQ, or la RAMQ, is the Régie de l'Assurance Maladie du Québec, or the Quebec Health Insurance Board, and is the government entity which manages the public health insurance that provides free basic health care to all citizens and permanent residents of Quebec. And finally, the SACRES and SQDC. These stand for the Société des Alcools du Québec and the Société Québécoise du Cannabis, and are the government-owned liquor and cannabis stores throughout the province. Unlike in the US, all liquor and cannabis stores in Quebec are government-owned, but beer and wine can still be bought in depths and grocery stores. There are, of course, many words which are unique to Quebec French, but these are some of the most common ones that I've heard in the last 10 years in Quebec. Some additional words you might come across include bibite, bobette, calé, clencher, chicane, gougoune, guenille, livre, maringouin, pelleté, vidange, and v'là. At last, the time has come to talk about les sacres. Les sacres are the famous religious swear words of Quebec. Whereas standard French swears center around similar vulgarities as English, like putain and merde, Quebec's sacres are overwhelmingly derived from words relating to the church. Just as the accent of French speakers in New France would have resembled that of French speakers in original France, so too did their swear words. Using words like sacrilège and sacre Dieu, or expressions like je renie Dieu, je vains Dieu, or je fais du tort à Dieu, were considered blasphemous and punishable by law. Around the end of the 1800s, these words and expressions branched out into different religious words, which started to be used not just as nouns, but as adjectives, verbs, and more, often with slightly different pronunciations to avoid using the actual word. Soon, everyday people were coming up with new, colorful ways to express themselves. Today, the sacres are an integral part of Quebec French and can be used in countless ways. Similar to English, each word has a milder, more PG version. For example, how damn becomes darn and hell becomes heck. These are called minced oaths, and I'll include a few for each word. So to begin, let's look at the most beloved, most iconic one. The mother of all Quebec swears, the T-bomb of Quebec, tabarnak comes from tabernacle, literally meaning tabernacle, which, in the Catholic faith, is the place where the Eucharist is held. This is the most vulgar of all the sacres and is to be used with the utmost discretion. More family-friendly variations include tabarnouche, tabarnache, tabarnan, tabarnik, tabarouette, tabarslack, and more. Another word to avoid around your Québécoise grandmother, calice, comes from calice, meaning chalice, which holds the wine which symbolizes the blood of Christ in the rite of the Eucharist. Some milder alternatives include calif, calin, calin de bin, and calic. The religious vocabulary of Quebec swears would not be complete without the Son of God himself, and so Christ, coming from Jésus Christ, is another favorite of sailor-mouthed Quebecers. Some milder alternatives include crime, crif, Christi, clis, cliff, and Christophe Colombe. Coming from hostie, or the host, the wafer which represents the body of Christ in the Eucharist, hostie, also pronounced esti, asti, or simply sti, is another frequently used profanity. Some milder alternatives include hostifie and ostination. Some other swears include calvaire, coming from calvaire, or Calvary, the site of Christ's crucifixion, ciboire, coming from ciboire, or ciborium, the cup which holds the host, maudit, or maudit, meaning damn or damned, and used the same way as in English, sacrement, coming from sacrement, or sacrament, which refers to a religious rite, and simoniac, which seems to come from simoniac, or someone who commits simony, the act of buying or selling church rolls or preference, and spiritual or sacred objects. Now, let's say one sac just isn't quite expressing the unadulterated rage you have inside you. Well, luckily for you, the sac can be mixed and matched into a string of sac with enough blasphemous expletives and profanity to make a 19th century priest roll over in his grave. This can be achieved with the word de, typically used as of or from, but here used as a kind of link to combine various sacres. Some examples include hostie de Christ à tabarnak, calice de tabarnak, Christ de calice, hostie de Christ de sacrement de tabarnak de Saint-Cyboire. You'll hear the sacre used as nouns, such as être en tabarnak or être en Christ, meaning to be angry, or phrases like mon tabarnak for someone of ill repute. Additionally, the sacre can be used as verbs. You'll most often hear this with the words Christ and calice, and often used to say to throw or to put forcefully, as in mettre, laisser, and donner. Some examples include je vais te crisser dehors, crisse-moi la paix, je veux crisser mon camp, je m'en crisse, je m'en calisse, je m'en contre-calisse. Des calices, They can also be used as adverbs, such as in the phrases c'est bon en tabarnak, c'est calissement bon, or c'est mauvais en crise. In Quebec, you'll also hear a few swears borrowed from France French and from English. For example, not to be confused with this fuck. Fuck is used quite a bit in Quebec. You'll hear it in phrases such as what the fuck, c'est fucking cher, and fucky, which means weird or wacky, as in le film était fucky, or lui c'est un fucky, and fuck all, used similarly as in English to mean none or nothing at all. You'll also hear the word merde, meaning shit, typically pronounced as marde, such as in the phrase mange la marde. There are countless variations and combinations of these words and phrases that you'll hear around Quebec. And now that you're equipped with these primary colors of profanity, it's time to go out and paint your own vivid, blasphemous pictures of obscenity with the paintbrush of your vocal cords onto the canvas of conversation. In France and abroad, you're likely to hear English words used by French speakers, but here in Quebec, these same words often have their own translations. For example, parking becomes stationnement, email becomes courriel, business becomes affaire or entreprise, challenge becomes défi, etc. But Quebec French and English have a complicated relationship, and here in Quebec, you'll still hear a lot of English words and phrases. In recent years, there's been so much of an increase in the use of English words, especially among the younger generations, that the Ministère de la Langue Française made this video to raise awareness.
Le faucon pèlerin. Cet oiseau de proie vraiment sec est reconnu pour être assez chill. Parce qu'il est super quick en vol, il peut passer la majorité de son temps à watcher son environnement. Mais malgré que ses skills de chasse soient insane, l'avenir du faucon pèlerin demeure sketch.
In my experience, the use of English words or anglicisms are a part of everyday French in Quebec, especially but not exclusively in Montreal. So here are the ones I've heard the most. Anyway, as in anyway or in any case. For example, anyway, toi ça va? Or j'ai pas eu la job mais je voulais pas travailler là anyway. Bienvenue. In English, if somebody thanks you, instead of replying you're welcome, you may just reply with welcome. This is how bienvenue, the French word meaning welcome, as in to receive or accept, is sometimes used in Quebec. Blonde and chum, meaning girlfriend and boyfriend respectively. For example, c'est ma blonde depuis 2 ans. C'était mon chum à l'époque. Chum or chum de fille can also be used to refer to a friend. Boss, meaning boss, as in the context of a job, or as a greeting like hey boss or hey chief. J'aime ma job mais mon boss il est pas gentil. Cute, meaning cute, as in ton chien il est donc ben cute. Checker, meaning to check or verify, as in laisse-moi checker quelque chose. Date. Not to be confused with date. A date is a romantic date or meeting. For example, je peux pas, j'ai une date avec ma blonde. Face, meaning face, as in t'as quelque chose sur la face. Filer and feeling, meaning to feel and feeling, as in j'ai un bon feeling pour l'examen. Or je le file pas pantoute. Fine, used to say fine or okay, often in casual agreement or to brush something off. C'est fine pour moi. Full. Coming from full, this is mostly used as an intensifier to say très or vraiment in casual Quebec speech. La tourtière était full bonne. Fun, meaning fun, and often written as le fun, as in j'aime ça patiner, c'est le fun. Hot. Coming from the English hot, hot means cool, impressive, or great, as in sa musique est vraiment hot. Job, meaning job, as in j'ai pogné une job, or j'aime pas ma job. Joke, meaning joke, as in c'était juste une joke. Live, meaning right now, as in on y va live. Man, meaning man, for example, how it's used in the context, hey man, what's up? Salut man, ça va? Weird, meaning weird, as in ah ouais, c'est vraiment weird. Some other words include bisic, beans, gum, gun, laptop, lift, place, and slush. Hi. So first of all, thanks for making it this far into the video. I know that this has been a lot of information, so thanks for sticking around. Before concluding, I thought it would be helpful to share some of the things that helped me the most when I was learning Quebec French. For these tips, I'll be obviously talking about Quebec French, but you can use them pretty much for learning any language. Number 1, listen to Quebec French. Whether this is by discovering music, TV shows, movies, podcasts, listening to Quebec French spoken by real Quebecers is going to be one of the most valuable things you can do for learning Quebec French. When I moved to Montreal, this was discovering new music, whether it was discovering modern music on websites like Bandcamp, where you can filter by location, or by discovering the classic, most beloved musicians of Quebec. Discovering Quebec music is really great because not only do you find really great music, but once you start to listen to the music enough, you start to internalize it. And for me, I was at the point where I was like kind of singing along to songs, even though I didn't really know what I was singing. So eventually when I decided to actually look up the lyrics and then translate the lyrics, from then on, I pretty much knew what I was listening to. And I actually wound up picking up a lot of words that way because I wound up listening to the songs so much that I got that kind of repetition without it really feeling like a memorization exercise. So that was really helpful. For movies, if you're already in Canada, you can access the website of the National Film Board of Canada, or the Office National du Film du Canada, which gives you completely free access to a ton of really amazing Canadian cinema, including a lot of really great, really legendary Quebec French films. When I first moved to Montreal, basically I just tried to find as many TV shows and movies that I could watch as possible that would be in Quebec French. And watching with subtitles when it's possible is also really helpful. Even if you don't understand 100% of what's being said, can be really helpful for comprehension. And finally, listening to podcasts, or balado as they're called in Quebec, on platforms like Audio or Apple Podcasts is also really great for comprehension, since on podcasts people tend to speak pretty much how they would in everyday conversation. But if you want something that's a little bit more articulated, a little bit slower, listening to news podcasts like Le Radio Journal by Radio-Canada is also a really good option for comprehension. The only caveat is that you won't really get that kind of everyday conversational slang that you might get with a regular podcast. Number 2, write in French. For me, one of the things that's been the most helpful is writing lists. God knows I like a good list. So when I'm planning out my day, I'll write a to-do list. And on that to-do list, typically, I wind up writing the same things. I'm going to be using specific verbs like go, clean, look for, call, things like that. If you have a routine where you're doing kind of the same things more or less every day, this is a really helpful way to pick up certain words because, again, you're doing repetition without it really feeling like an exercise. At first, you'll have to translate the words as you're writing them down, but then you'll start to just remember. This is also really useful for when you're going to the grocery store, or the pharmacy, or just running any kind of errands. So this is really good for learning different foods, everyday essentials. The only thing is that you're not really learning conversational French, but it's still really helpful because a lot of these words are just going to be basics that you can use pretty much anywhere. Finally, doing translations or transcriptions. This is something that I found to be really helpful, especially if I have a specific text that I am really familiar with. So whether it's song lyrics or an excerpt from a book, a favorite poem, a quote, anything that you kind of already know by heart that you can translate into French. Just the act of sitting down with pen and paper and having to physically write out the translation, I think you wind up internalizing it a little bit more, especially if you do it a few times. And of course, this works really well the other way around. Like I mentioned before, if you find a song that you really like and you know it pretty much by heart, but you actually don't know the translation of the lyrics, just taking the time to look up the lyrics and then go line by line and translate them, especially writing them out by hand, is a really helpful way to learn new words. Number 3, read in French. This is another tip that applies kind of more broadly to just language learning and maybe less specifically to Quebec French. So reading is obviously really important for learning a language, but it's great when you can find ways to do it where it doesn't really feel like practice so much as just a part of an activity that you're already doing. So one thing that can be really helpful is watching a movie or a TV show in your native language, in my case English, but then putting on French subtitles. If you're not fully ready to watch a movie or watch a TV show that's fully in French, this can be kind of like a good alternative, like a stepping stone, since you're going to be listening to dialogue in your native language, but then you're going to be reading the French. So inevitably you kind of wind up picking up new words this way. So next, finding things to read on topics you care about, whether it's the news or movie reviews, or anything that isn't about like Pierre going down to the boulangerie to like get his baguette. That can be really helpful because even if you don't understand 100% of what you're reading, you actually care about what it is about. And finally, if you're at maybe an intermediate level with reading and you feel comfortable doing this, changing your phone or your laptop's language settings to be in Canadian French is a really great option for kind of a at-home immersion. By doing this, there are certain words you'll pick up super quickly just because you'll be seeing them all the time. And if you do this on your phone, your GPS is actually going to be giving you directions in French. So you'll learn your lefts and rights, your norths and souths, etc. Number 4, speak in Quebec French. So if you're visiting Quebec or you're already in Quebec, going out and just speaking to people whenever you can is probably going to help you more than anything else on this list. I think some people have a belief that Quebecers are going to be really mean or they're going to be judgmental if you don't speak French perfectly with them or if you just try speaking French at all. But in my experience, I haven't really had any issues with speaking French with anyone here. Like, everyone's really nice. And as Anglophones, and I think especially Americans, we sort of have a reputation for expecting everyone, everywhere in the entire world to speak our language. So Quebecers honestly really appreciate, even if you just learn a few basics like hello, how are you, I'd like to order a, thank you, have a good day, goodbye. Learning even just a few words in the local language of the place you're visiting is just a nice sign of respect and shows people that you care. Specifically in Montreal, it can be uniquely difficult to practice French here because so many people grow up with English. So for the most part, people are at least comfortable, if not completely fluent, in English along with French. When I first moved here, I pretty quickly learned that if I wanted to speak French, I would basically have to force myself to keep speaking French even if someone switched to English to accommodate me. But you do kind of have to choose your battles, and sometimes it's just easier to speak English. If you live in Montreal or you've spent some time in Montreal, you probably also know that it's really easy to fall into Anglophone bubbles. Whether it's the West Island or pockets of Anglophones up in the Plateau or the Mile End, it can be really easy to kind of surround yourself with English and then not really ever have to speak French. So stepping out of your comfort zone and putting yourself in situations where you have to speak French is really important for learning French in Montreal specifically. Something else which is really helpful and also extremely humbling is recording yourself. Even just in making this video and then having to listen back to my own voice speaking French, I realized just how off I was with certain pronunciations. So recording yourself and listening back to yourself can be a really great way to pick up on certain things that you might not notice if you're just having a conversation. But listening to native speakers, or better yet, just talking with a native speaker, is of course going to be the best thing you can do. Which brings me to the next tip. Number 5, don't take yourself too seriously. There will be times when you're first learning a language when you just can't keep up with other people and you're going to wind up doing more listening than talking. There was one time in probably my 3rd year in Montreal when I was starting to feel pretty comfortable with my French. One of my friends from France said, hey, my mom is coming into town and she wants to meet my friends. So he invited a bunch of us over to come meet his mom, come hang out. And so I'm imagining that basically she's going to come and be like, hey, friends of my son, what do you guys study? What do you guys like to do in Montreal? And so I was like, oh, that's gonna be fine. I'm gonna be able to practice my French. She's probably gonna ask, what I'm studying or, whatever. So I show up and they pretty much immediately just start talking about French politics, philosophy, and real estate for some reason. I think probably for the whole discussion, I don't think I really said anything. I just was like listening to everything that was being said. And one of the frustrating things about being at that kind of intermediate level is that I could understand what they were saying. Like I got the gist of the conversation. I was following more or less what they were talking about. But by the time that I had fully formed a thought and then was going to say that thought out loud, they were like 4 topics ahead. As mentioned before, you do just kind of have to pick your battles and stay humble. For example, there was one time in my first year in Montreal that I went to a very busy bar. I tried to order a beer in French. But apparently I was taking too long because the barman looked at me and in English said, hey man, your French isn't that bad, but I really have to take your order. Ow. Ow. So sometimes you'll make mistakes, sound a bit silly, misgender inanimate objects, and sometimes say something that's wildly inappropriate because you thought that you were saying something that was completely normal, but it was actually horribly, horribly filthy, and nobody corrected you, and you actually said it with a lot of confidence, which I can't relate to. And number 6, have fun. Learning another language opens doors to so many new experiences, perspectives, forms of art, cultures, and honestly, it's just fun. Just being able to go out in the world and switch languages, communicate with different people in different languages, it feels like a superpower. If you have the privilege of being an English speaker and kind of know that you don't really need to learn another language if you want to travel to most places, then it can kind of be easy to say, well, why bother? Why go through the effort of learning another language if I can get by with English? But since I moved to Quebec, there have been so many incredible memories that I've made, so many incredible people that I've met, so many things I've been able to do and be a part of that just never would have been possible if I never took the time to learn French. But you don't have to become completely fluent in a language to be able to communicate with people and make connections with people. You'd be surprised how much a little bit goes a long way. Also, learning a language is just really healthy for your brain. And, these days we could all use a little bit of mental exercise. And a bonus tip, if you've recently moved to Quebec, the Quebec government actually offers francisation courses, which is a French language learning program where you can learn French for free. And in some cases, they'll actually pay for you to learn French. Fait que, enfin, c'est la fin de la vidéo. Me semble que ça fait 5 ans que je veux faire cette vidéo. Je l'avais faite il y a 5 ans, mais j'avais comme tout improvisé, j'ai comme tout filmé en une nuit. Puis après, j'étais comme, non, j'ai envie de vraiment bien faire ça. Et ça fait maintenant, je pense, 7 mois que je travaille sur cette vidéo. Fait que si tu as aimé la vidéo, si ça a aidé et ça te tente de contribuer, tu peux m'acheter un petit café au lien en bas. Ça serait bien smart de toi. Mais sinon, s'il y a de quoi que j'ai oublié ou si tu as une question, n'hésite pas de laisser un commentaire. J'espère que tu as eu du fun. Mais en tout cas, thanks again for watching and happy language learning.